So welcome, good evening. If you do have any, by the way, if you do have any questions about the technical setup, you'd like to learn how to do this, give me a call. We can set up a time. I'm happy to walk through anybody. I've put the offer out to other rabbis who have approached me and said, how are you doing this? I've put the offer out to, obviously all of you, anybody who's interested. I'm happy to share what I've learned in this strange time of pandemic and social distancing when we've all become uh, web gurus and video production experts. Um, it's strange times. All of these skills we never thought we needed to know, now we've got them. But of course, that's not what we're here to talk about today. You can give me a call anytime. You've got my phone number. If not, send me a message. Well, you know how to get a hold of me. I'm not difficult. Reach out to me anytime, and I will give you be happy to walk through anything with you, whether it's related to the class or just life in general, whether it's related to technology in your life or whether it is related to life, unconnected with technology, whatever the case might be. I'm happy to chat. Let's begin with a very basic question. This is our fundamental premise. What is prayer? It's a good place to start. If we're going to talk about prayer, we need to know what it is, right? This makes sense. On its most simple level, the basic definition of what is prayer: communication with the divine. That is what prayer means in every culture, every civilization, every time period, every location. This is the simple definition of prayer: some form of communication with the divine. What constitutes communication? What constitutes the divine? That might vary from one culture to another, but the basic definition of what is prayer is fundamental, and it's fundamental. You don't find, to my knowledge, maybe there's a historian out there who's watching, but I have not found uh, any definitive civilization in which there is no prayer whatsoever. As far as I know, it doesn't exist. Every single human civilization, every human culture has some form of an attempt to communicate with the divine. That's what we call prayer. It happens in all cultures. There are many different forms of prayer. I'm going to talk about a few. This is not an exhaustive list. It's not intended to be. But the earliest forms of Jewish prayer, and in fact the world in which Judaism emerged, the ancient Near East, that's what we call it. The ancient Near East, and which is the Mediterranean, which is North Africa, which is Persia, India, that entire part of the world. The most common, and in fact the only acceptable form of worship, of prayer, that is to say, communicating with the divine, is offerings or sacrifices. You had your God, you would take usually food or beverage. There were other forms of offerings, but usually food or beverage that you would take and offer to the God. There were also, offerings of money where you would bring some coins. There are offerings of other things, abstract things even. There is a famous, I was not able to find the quote, I'll have to look it up. If you remind me next week, I'll tell you what it was. There is, in fact, a quote from a Greek philosopher who said, without the sacrifice, meaning without the animal sacrifice, prayer is just words. So it was an early criticism of when prayer began to move away from offerings and sacrifices. In a way, it makes sense. If you want your deity to do something for you, then give something to your deity in return. If you want to make your God happy, well, what do you do to make a friend happy or your parents happy? If you give them a gift, that's a pretty good way to do it. We just came out of Hanukkah. We're coming up on Christmas, which in some of your families is also a major gift-giving holiday. And this, the act of giving gifts, it's a can be a form of sacred communication, right? If somebody gives you a really good gift, that communicates something that words cannot. If someone gives you a really lousy gift, that might communicate something too. I don't know. I won't get into that. I know there are some couples there watching, joining us right now, so we won't get into anything related to that. Well, this eventually changed. It was the prophet Hosea who said, bring me the offering of your lips. He's criticizing the temple offering, saying there are people who bring all of their bulls to the temple, but then they don't actually do what they say they're going to do. They don't live a righteous life. So he said, don't bring me your bulls and your sheep and your doves and whatever other offerings you're bringing to the temple. He says, bring me the offerings of your lips. Those are much more valuable to me. This eventually developed into silent prayer. This we read every Yom Kippur when Hannah was praying at the temple. She prayed silently, and it was a totally new innovation. We know because the priest who saw her praying thought, oh my goodness, something is wrong with this woman. I don't know what it is. Maybe she's drunk, but she's just sitting there. She's talking, and she's not even talking out loud. Her lips are moving, but she's not saying anything. What the heck is she doing? Well, it turns out she was praying. She was inventing a new type of prayer that we still use to this day, which is silent prayer, prayer of the heart, avodah shebalev. In fact, avodah shebalev is even the name of the Reform Sidur in Israel. If you ever travel to Israel, you go to a Reform congregation, you'll probably be using avodah shebalev. Let's talk about the different types of prayer. So we've talked about the different forms of prayer, right? Offerings, words, silent prayer. These are different forms of prayer. But what about the content of that prayer? And this applies to all different types of prayer. By the way, what are some other examples of different types, not types of prayer, but different expressions of prayer other than offerings, other than words? It could be dance. There are cultures that pray through dance. There are cultures that pray through music. There are cultures that pray through um, different types of rituals, which could be connected with offerings or not. There are cultures that pray through body modification, through tattoos or piercings that have a sacred meaning. There are all sorts of different ways that this communication can be facilitated. But this is sort of a chronological Jewish experience of prayer. Now, the content of those prayers can also vary. You've got praise. God, you are so amazing. I can't believe how amazing you are, God. That's praise. You've got also known as shevach. You've got petition, which is bakasha, or request. God, please give me, oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? That's the, I don't know if there are anybody who of that generation there. Extra credit if you could tell me in the chat or after class who sang that song. Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? That's a petition. Thanksgiving. God, thank you for all of these wonderful things. Thank you for these wonderful students who are joining me this evening. Thank you for this roof that's over my head. Thank you for all of whatever. That's Thanksgiving. Hoda'ah. This is also, by the way, those of you who follow me on Facebook know that Hoda'ah or Hodah is Hodu is also related to, or the same as the word for turkey, which makes it very appropriate that Thanksgiving we eat turkey. It's an interesting quirk of the Hebrew language. We're going to come back to those three, but let me talk about a couple of other types of prayer. There are confessional prayers. In Judaism, it's less common, but there's a vidui. This comes up most prominently in two places, either during the high holidays when we have our communal confession, Ashamnu, Bagadnu, we've sinned against you, we've sinned against ourselves. And the second place that it comes up is on one's deathbed. There is a vidui prayer, a confessional prayer upon one's deathbed. We're going to talk more about that when we have our session on mourning rituals, death, and dying in the afterlife, which is a lot in one class, but we'll manage. There are prayers of submission. God, you are great, we are puny. God, you're amazing, we exist to serve you. This is not so common in Judaism. The closest example I could find was the Aleinu, which is one where we literally bow down in submission to God. We say Aleinu l'shabech. It is our obligation to bless you. Aleinu l'shabeach. That's the closest that we come to submission, but you see this in some of our sister religions. In Islam, in fact, the word Islam means submission. Muslim is one who submits to God. You see this in Christianity, the idea of, you're not allowed to challenge God or question God, you have to submit to God. You have this idea in a lot of other religions, not so much in Judaism. I'm not saying it's not in Judaism at all, but it's less common than in some other faiths. You have meditative, mantra, or ecstatic prayer. This is prayer that doesn't have any, the content of the prayer is not something that can be written out. It's not something that can be described. It is transcendent. It is about a feeling or an experience that is being in close communion with the divine, whatever that is, with the universe, with God. You only see this in Judaism, in Kabbalah, in mysticism, and in fact in a particular practice of mysticism that we appropriately call ecstatic mysticism. This is, trying to become one with God, where the boundary between you and God overlap or blur, where you are having some sort of experience of encountering God. That's a form of prayer as well. Intercession. This is similar to a petition, which is asking for something, except it is asking on behalf of someone else. This is another one that's uncommon in modern Judaism. But it has some very interesting forms that sort of sprinkled throughout the history of Judaism. In the book of Genesis, you have kings of other nations who approach Abraham and say, Abraham, we know that you're really close with God. We know that you've got this special covenant. Will you pray for us on our behalf? You don't have that as much in classical Judaism, but you see it in modern day Judaism in a couple of different forms as well. You see it in Reform Judaism. We have the Misha Berach prayer. We've only been doing Misha Berach lecholim as part of our regular liturgy in the Reform temple for maybe 40 or 50 years. That's a late 20th century development. It was one of the parts of the service that was really all but eliminated, because the idea of a prayer which is compelling God to do something that God may or may not want to do was anathema to early Reform rabbis and early Reform participants. The second place that we see it in modern day Judaism is in Orthodox Judaism, and in particular ultra-Orthodox Judaism, in reciting Tehillim. I specifically said that in the Ashkenazi. It's not Tehillim, it's Tehillim, right? Which is by reciting psalms You can, Orthodox Jews believe that reciting Psalms can bring blessing, in particular blessings for healing on other people as well. You can recite Tehillim on behalf of someone else, and that will bring, God's blessing through one person onto another one. So it's one that's not. None of these actually are totally foreign to Judaism, but it's these first three that really form the heart of Jewish prayer: praise, petition, and thanksgiving. If you're going to put something in your notes, put those three. You might also want to note the very last line here: prayer versus blessing is an important distinction in Judaism. What is a prayer? I already told you. Prayer is any type of communication with God. A blessing is a very specific formula of a type of prayer. There are prayers that are not blessed. It's like, the Venn diagram, right? When you studied for the SATs or whatever test you took in high school. All blessings are prayers, but not all prayers are blessings, right? A blessing is a type of prayer. Every blessing in Judaism begins with Baruch Atah Adonai. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God. And the formulation that happens after that can be different. Or I should say, every blessing contains Baruch Atah Adonai. There are different forms of, there's a long form of blessing, there are short blessings, but they are specific blessings that are, they're specific formulas that we use to communicate with God. Let's talk about the prayer service as it exists today. And when I say as it exists today, this is the same prayer service that we have followed for hundreds of years in Judaism. And this is across Jewish boundaries. Every group within Judaism follows this structure to some degree or another, that this is the structure of the service. I grew up with, and maybe some of you did too, I grew up with the Gates of Prayer. You remember the Gates of Prayer, the blue one? That was my prayer book, and it had the 4 or 5 different versions of each service. So you would have, evening service 1, evening service 2, evening service 3. And there were 4 or 5 different ones. And so, the rabbi would come. I lived in a community where the rabbi was not there permanently when I was growing up. And so the rabbi would come and they would pick some prayers from different services, and we were always flipping. And now we turn to page 321. Okay, now we turn to page 112, and we're flipping back and forth between these different services. I had no idea when I was a kid that there was an order to the service. Except for Aleinu and Kaddish, I knew that meant we were getting close to the Oneg. That was all I knew about the order of the service. Usually there was a song at the beginning, usually there's a song at the end, but everything in the middle, I thought it was just whatever the rabbi felt, because we were flipping around these pages forward and backward. No, that's not the case. Every Jewish prayer service follows a fixed structure, beginning with opening benedictions. Now the examples, let's see if I can actually see my notes while I'm reading this. The examples of the opening benedictions, it depends on which service it is, but that includes the Kabbalat Shabbat. That's when we sing, that's when we sing, for example, when we're singing, I'm drawing a total blank. I'm picturing the slides in my head. Boi Kala, when we're singing the Kabbalat Shabbat prayers. Lechu Naranana, that's one that we don't really sing that much. Trying to think of some other familiar ones for you. Those are an example of opening benedictions on a Friday evening service. But you can also have opening benedictions as part of a different service. For example, Birkot HaShachar. If you're here for a Saturday morning service, you hear the opening blessings, and they're totally different from the evening service, but they're the same every week, right? That's followed by some verses of Torah, usually Psalms, uh, different passages from Psalms. You know, when we sing Hallelujah, 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 that's from Psalms. That's followed by a group of prayers called the Shema and her blessings. Why is the Shema a girl? I don't know. That's just what it's called. Shema and her blessings. We're going to talk about what that consists of in a moment. That's followed by the Amidah, also known as Ha-Tefillah, the Tefillah, also known as the Shmona Esrei, the 18 benedictions. And there are one or two other names. Those are the main ones that you'll hear. If you ever hear somebody talking about the Amidah, somebody's talking about the Tefillah, somebody's talking about the Shmon Esrei, sometimes Shmona Esrei becomes Shmon Esrei. That's all the same thing. We're talking about the 18 benedictions. That's followed by a Torah service on a service where there is a Torah service. We only read the Torah on mornings, and we only read it on certain weekdays. We always read Torah on Shabbat mornings and Shabbat afternoons as well, but on weekday mornings, we only read the Torah on certain mornings. That's followed by the concluding prayers. What are the concluding prayers? Quite simply, that's Aleinu, Mourner's Kaddish, and not necessarily Mourner's Kaddish. Usually Mourner's Kaddish. It could be another Kaddish depending on the prayer service. The afternoon service, it's a different Kaddish. So it's the Aleinu, it's the Kaddish, and it's usually a closing song. The Shema and the Amidah. This is the heart of the service. This is the origin of the service. These are the parts that are commanded. Everything else is preparation for the service, but this is the part that, at least according to the rabbis of the Talmud, this is what it's all about right here. These are the two parts that are commanded. So how do we end up with this fixed prayer service? It starts right here with this seed. So let's take a closer look at the Shema. We begin with the Baruch Hu. That's our call to prayer. Have you ever wondered why our call to prayer is in the middle of the service? We already said like 20 blessings. And now the rabbi's saying, this is our call to prayer. Now we're standing up and this is our call to prayer. Well, yeah, because all of that other stuff at the beginning is to prepare you, to get you in the right spirit, the right mentality to pray. The actual call to prayer doesn't happen until the Baruch Hu. I also think that that's if you're the kind of person like me where you're just biologically inclined to be running a few minutes late. I know there's some others out there. It's a lifelong struggle. I know, and I feel it. I feel for you, and I feel the struggle. It can be done. It can be done. If you're one of those people who's always running a few minutes late and you're late to the service, at least you made it for the Baruch Hu, so you're covered. By the way, the Torah blessings include the Baruch Hu. Did you ever notice that? Why do we repeat the Baruch Hu and in the Torah blessings? Why do we repeat the Shema when we take the Torah out? That's just in case you're really running late. You know, then you're in trouble. You got to work it out with God. But at least you're covered because you said the Baruch Hu and you said the Shema. The Baruch Hu is always followed by two blessings, which are creation and love. Sometimes it's called creation and revelation. What is revelation? That's God giving us the Torah. How do we describe that experience that God gave us the Torah? That's an expression of love. So there's the connection there. The creation blessing, depending on if it's the morning or the evening, and Shema is always morning or evening, not afternoon. We'll talk about why in just a moment. Shema is twice a day. In the morning, it's Yotzer Or. In the evening, it's Ma'ariv Aravim, also called Arvit, right? Love or redemption, that's always going to be Ahavat Olam or Ahava Rabbah. Then after we've said the Baruch Hu, our call to prayer, and after we've said these two blessings, then we're prepared to say the Shema. We recite the Shema. The Shema is actually, it's some verses that go together. It's not just the 6 words of Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. It's also the passage that comes after that, which is from a totally different part of the Bible, Baruch Shem Kavod. That's not found in the Torah. Yeah, pull up a chair. That's not found in the Torah. The Baruch Shem Kavod is from it's a different passage. It's a response to the Shema. But if you open up the Torah, if you look at Deuteronomy 6, then you'll find the Shema immediately followed by V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. Right? That's one passage. So when I say the Shema, that includes the V'ahavta. Now here's an interesting thing. You may have noticed during some of our services, during the Shema, that I will say, because this is a congregation that includes Reform practice, conservative practice, international practices, Orthodox practices, you name it, we've got it, right? Israeli practices. I guess we do. We've got a couple of Israelis. So I will often say when we come to the Shema during our services, if it is your custom to remain standing through the Shema, then you may be seated after the Shema. This is a practice that came out of early Reform practices, where the rabbi said, look, the Shema is the most important prayer. This is our call to our tradition. It is the watchword of our faith. That was the phrase that they loved to use, the watchword of our faith. It's the most important prayer that we have, not a blessing, but a prayer. It's the most important prayer that we have. We should mark it in some kind of a special way. So what should we do for the Shema? If we're going to be standing for the Baruch Hu, if we're going to be standing for the Amidah, then we should be standing for the Shema. And that's what they did. But in the Talmud it says, if you're standing for the Shema, you can continue standing. If you're sitting for the Shema, you should continue sitting. You shouldn't change in between. So they said, okay, you'll stand up for the Baruch Hu, and then you stay standing until we get to the Shema, and then you can sit down. So that's a custom that you'll find in a lot of classical Reform synagogues, and also in some not so classical Reform synagogues. You see a lot of people that are very, modern day or postmodern Reform that will stay standing through the Shema. You may have grown up with that custom yourself. There's 2 blessings before the Shema, and there's 1 blessing after the Shema. That's the Michamocha, followed by Tzur Yisrael or Hashkivenu. That's the blessing part of Michamocha. How is Michamocha connected with redemption? This is one you should know. Michamocha is a passage from the book of Exodus. It's from the Song of the Sea. The Michamocha are the words that our ancestors sang as they crossed out of Egypt, as they crossed the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. These are the words that they sang as they were leaving. So that's the Shema, and then it's followed by the Amidah. This, by the way, if I didn't tell you at the beginning, this is a lot of information in this class. It's very important in this session. There's a lot of important information. So if you're not taking notes, I recommend it. There's a lot of material. There's a lot of details, but they're really important to understand, the basics. This is not just the big ideas of Judaism, but the how-tos of Judaism. If you're taking this class for conversion, you don't want to know just the idea of Judaism. You want to know the how-to of Judaism. And in fact, chances are, even if you're taking this as a Jew, you're learning new things and you're saying, this explains why we have that particular practice or why we do this in a certain way. It's probably also still a good idea to take notes. So the Shmona Esrei, the Amidah, the Tefillah, is a set of blessings, beginning with 3 blessings of praise. This is Avot, Givorot, and Kedusha. That's Avot meaning literally parents, but really forebearers. That's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, right? When we say that prayer. Avot, Givorot, Ata Gibur, you're great. And Kedusha, holiness, God, you are holy. Kadoshata, right? Those are the opening three blessings. That's followed by either 13 blessings of petition or just one blessing on Shabbat. Why do we not include blessings of petition on Shabbat? Because it's our day of rest, but even before it was our day of rest, it was God's day of rest. We don't want to be asking God to do work on Shabbat, right? We don't say, God, can you save us? God, can you heal us? God, can you bring redemption? We don't want to ask God to do work on Shabbat. So we leave off the 13 blessings of petition, and instead we include just one blessing of God's holiness for blessing Shabbat. That's followed by 3 blessings of thanksgiving. That's usually, at least in our custom, part of the silent prayer. Now, you don't usually have to do a lot of math in any of my classes. Occasionally, I'll drop a little bit of mathematics out there, but here's some simple math. Add these 3 numbers together. 3 plus 13 plus 3, and you get 18, right? No, you get 19. Why are the 18 blessings 19 blessings? That's a whole nother question for a whole nother time. Maybe that would be a good adult ed class to do one day, where we can look into why the Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings, are actually 19 blessings, because like many things in Judaism, there are different responses, there are different answers about how that came about and why. The Amidah is done in fact, the word Amidah means the standing prayer. Tefillah means the prayer, right? This is the prayer said while standing, so you can call it the standing prayer, Amidah. Omed, Na la'amod would be please rise. Again, if you ever find yourself in a synagogue in Israel and the rabbi says Na la'amod, please rise, that's Amidah. Tefillah means prayer. So this is the prayer. And then we say it while standing. Why do we say it while standing? Because that's considered a position of special respect and of focus. We also have bowing during the Amidah, because this is when we are directly addressing God, right? Because we are directly addressing God at this point, that's where we show our respect, just as you would show respect if you were in the presence of royalty. If you're going to show that kind of respect, standing and bowing for a human ruler, showing respect that way, then for sure, all the more so, you should do that for God. And in fact, the bowing is based on the not chivalry, but like what came before chivalry in the ancient Near East, the court practices is that you would bow in greeting to the sovereign, and then before you left, you would bow again as you were leaving. And so we bow twice in the Amidah. We bow once at the beginning, and actually we bow at the beginning. We bow twice during the beginning prayer. So when we say the Avot, we bow at the beginning and end of the Avot, which is the first of these 18 blessings. And we don't bow. You'll see people bowing just because you see Baruch Atah Adonai, and you have that bow, and then people bow every time they say Baruch. They'll bow 18 times. No, that's just a habit because nobody explained why we're bowing. We bow at the beginning. We bow at Avot during that prayer, and then we bow at the end of the silent prayer during Oseh Shalom, and you'll see people bow in three directions: Oseh Shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh Shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael bimro amen. Right? Because again, this goes back to the ancient Near Eastern customs, the court traditions. You meet a sovereign and you bow not only to the guy in charge, but you've got people sitting on the right and the left, right? You've got the advisors sitting on either side. And so you bow, to the advisors, thank you for being here as well, and then to the sovereign. And we've taken that out of a human context and say we don't bow to a human sovereign, but we do bow to a divine sovereign. And we bow to God in the same way, because you wouldn't want to show God less respect than a human ruler. So that's where the bowing comes from. You bow during the avot, which is the first prayer. You don't bow in the middle, and then you bow at the end, which is sort of as you're entering the court, you would bow to the sovereign, and then as you're leaving, you would bow on your way out. And many people also will take 3 steps, forward to enter the court of God, and 3 steps back at the end of the prayer to sort of symbolically leave God's presence. So those are some things that you'll see. There's also a particular way of bowing. We bow first at the knees and then at the waist. That would be another good class. We could go into even greater depth and detail with this if you'd like for another class. But let's just do a quick review. This is the structure of the service. This is a diagram of what the service is. We start off, this happens to be a morning service that we're looking at. We start off with Birkot HaShachar, with the morning blessings. We move on to Psuke de Zimra. This is our transition from the mundane world, from the everyday world, and now we're transitioning to a higher level of holiness. Psuke de Zimra, now we're including actual words from the Tanakh, right? This could be Psalms, this could be Psuke de Zimra is mostly Psalms. Now, with these holy words, we move to an even higher level of blessing with the Shema. The Baruch Hu, which leads into the Shema, again, comes directly from the temple practice. It comes directly from the Torah, as does the Baruch Hu, or as does the Shema. And we surround the Shema with blessings. This is like an insulation. This is, if you're giving the Shema as a gift, this is the fancy wrapping paper, right? You've got a blessing on either side. And you put an extra blessing, an extra bow on top just to be safe. You've got 2 blessings before the Shema and then another blessing after the Shema. They're sort of hugging the Shema, right? Here, the Shema is conversations about God. This is also called our creed. It's the closest thing we have in Judaism to a creed. And then we move to an even higher point. Now we are standing up in the presence of God, in the metaphorical presence of God, our headspace. We are mentally placing ourselves in the presence of God and speaking with God directly. So this is an even higher level of holiness. The only way we could get to a higher level of holiness than speaking directly to God is having God answer us back. How does God answer us back? With words of Torah. That's how that's our communication back from God. God gave us the Torah. Those are the words that God gave us. And so the peak, the climax, the high point, the apex of the prayer service, when there is a Torah reading, this is, for example, a Shabbat morning, that would be when we read the Torah. Of course, you don't just run up the side of a mountain and then jump off a cliff. You got to come back down into the mundane world. And so we have our concluding prayers, the Aleinu and the Kaddish. They transition back into the mundane world. But if you notice, we we end up, even though we transition down into the everyday world, we're still at a higher point than when we began. The entire experience of the prayer service mimics rising up, ascending Sinai, receiving the Torah, and then coming back down. But even when we descend from Sinai, we are at a higher spiritual level than when we arrived. Every single prayer service is a recreation of Sinai. That's amazing. All right. I said I'd mention the why do we pray at certain times? The Shema is twice a day. How do we know? It says in the Shema. It says right there. This is Deuteronomy 6:7, right? Teach them faithfully to your children, recite them when you stay at home and when you are away. And then it says, when you lie down and when you rise up. B'shoch b'cha, when you lie down. Uvkumecha, when you get up. So how many times is that? Twice, when you lie down and when you get up. So you say the Shema twice a day. It's that simple. How do you know that you say it in the evening and the morning? What, you might say, well, what if I like to sleep in? Don't worry, that's why we have the Mishnah. They talk about that. They discuss why we say the Shema twice a day, why it's when you wake up and when you lie down, why that translates to morning and evening at particular times. It's not just whenever you happen to wake up. It is in the morning because that's when most people wake up and we pray as a community. We don't pray as individuals, right? You can pray as individuals, but the ideal form of prayer in Judaism is to pray as a community, as part of a minyan. Excuse me, just one moment. Okay, I apologize for that. We're back. What about the, so now you know why you say the, um, welcome back. Now I can see your head if you sit right there.
Just talk.
You can. It's nice to have you here. The Amidah, on the other hand, when you have, which we say 3 times a day, where do we get that from? Let's take a look at, what is this from? Brachot 26b, you automatically know it's the Talmud, right? When you see a funny word followed by a number, followed by an A or a B, you know it's the Talmud automatically. If you learn nothing else over a year of studying with me, you should be able to identify when something's from the Torah, when something's from the Tanakh, when something is from the Talmud, just by looking at the citation. When something's from the Midrash, and you should know what those are. So this is from the Talmud, from Tractate Barachot, Daf 26b. Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, the practice of praying 3 times a day is ancient, albeit not in its present form. Prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. This is according to Rabbi Yossi. However, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said the prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings of the temple. So who's right? Both of them. We pray 3 times a day. That corresponds to how often our offerings were given in the temple. And you can see descriptions of the temple offerings in, directly in the Torah. How often do we have different offerings during the day? 3 times a day. That's described in Leviticus, right? That's not a very satisfying answer. That's a good idea of how it evolved, because we know after the temple was destroyed, we transitioned to our spoken prayer, which represents our sacrificial offering, right? We'll talk about that in a moment as well. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said that's the basis, but Rabbi Yossi said it's based on the patriarchs. How does he explain that? It was taught in a baraita. I won't go into what a baraita is. It's just a type of writing. It was taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Hanina. Abraham instituted the morning prayer. As it is stated, when Abraham came to look out over Sodom in the day, he prayed on its behalf. So Abraham got up in the morning and then he prayed, right? And Abraham rose early in the morning and stood where he had stood before Adonai. If you wanted to look that up, it's Genesis 19:27. What is Genesis 19:27? I hope you know that that's from the Torah and you know how to find it. It continues. Isaac instituted the afternoon prayer, as it is stated. Isaac went out to converse in the field toward the evening. And then the Talmud goes on to explain that converse means pray. What else could it be? Who was he talking to? He wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to God. Okay. What is talking to God? That's the definition of prayer. There should be an ellipsis here. I was being lazy when I set these slides up. ... There's some other stuff that happens, and then we talk about Jacob instituted the evening prayer, as it is stated, and he encountered the place and he slept there, for the sun had set. And this word vayifga, hamakom, must mean, and it's discussed, if you can open up your Talmud at home, or you can Google it, put it on Safari. Very easy to find these days. You know, being able to copy and paste from the Talmud, this is a new thing. This didn't exist when I first started in rabbinical school. There was no Safaria. We had to actually go to the shelf and pull out a volume of Talmud and open it up, which is, I still recommend. It's nice to do, but it's also very convenient that you can pull this up on Safaria and you can read any passage you want at a moment's notice. You can even download it on your phone so you can read it on the plane. Not that you should be getting into a plane right now, or traveling if you're not going to do it safely. So here we have the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, instituting the three prayers at three key moments of their lives, right? What is Abraham doing here? This is where Abraham makes a decision. Oops, I went back too far. This is where Abraham has his debate with God, right? Abraham has this whole conversation with God about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. Isaac is out in the field praying. This is when he meets Rebecca, right? His wife. Pretty important moment. Any folks out there who are married will tell you, the moment you meet your spouse, that's pretty significant, right? And of course, Jacob, when is he at Hamakom? We're going to talk about that, the place, Hamakom. This is when he is leaving his family, leaving his home, when he stops to sleep on the way and has this vision of angels going up and coming down. All right, the stairway to heaven. Some of you are of that generation. Extra points if you can tell me who sang Stairway to Heaven. Double extra points if you can play the opening on your guitar. Holy spaces. Let's talk about where we pray. I talked about this word hamakom, which shows up in the book of Genesis, for example. This is another name for God. It's understood wherever we see this hamakom, that is a metonym. That's a signal that we're talking about God. It's one of the names of God, is makom. Where is Jacob when he has this encounter with makom, with God's place? According to Jewish tradition, he was at Mount Moriah. Where is Mount Moriah? That's also where Isaac was bound by his father Abraham. It's also where David was sent and told in a vision to build the temple. It's where Solomon constructed the temple. It's the Temple Mount where you go now. We don't ascend the Temple Mount. Most Jews don't ascend the Temple Mount, but we do pray at the outer edge of the Temple Mount, which is the Western Wall, the holiest place in Judaism, the holiest makom that you can pray in Judaism. That's as close as we come in modern times until the temple should be reconstructed. If that's something you believe should happen, that would be, again, a whole other class. But that's the holiest place in Judaism, and that was, for centuries, that was the only place where Jews were able to communicate with God uninterruptedly. That was the only place where we could make sacrificial offerings, which before words were invented as a form of prayer, that was our only form of prayer. And so the temple in Jerusalem, at the Temple Mount, really that should be a capital T and a capital M. I'll have to fix that for next year. The Temple Mount was this holy place. It was the only holy place, or the only exclusively holy place for hundreds of years in Judaism until the temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era. After that time, Judaism went off in a couple of different directions. There were different sects who believed different things. You had, Essenes who believed the world was ending. Okay, the temple is destroyed, the world's going to end. They went off into the desert and wrote extra scrolls and books that became the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what they did. You had the Christians who went off and said, okay, the temple is destroyed. We're going to start a whole new religion that's based on Judaism, but it doesn't need the temple because we have this whole different system of offering and prayer. And they became a whole new religion. You had other religions that eventually became offshoots. You also had the rabbis who, although there were already rabbis at the time, they were not the central authorities in Judaism until the temple was destroyed. When there were no more priests to turn to, the people turned to the rabbis and said, what should we do? And the rabbis, in their wisdom, said, wait a minute, we already have the answer. God has made our homes a holy place. Our families are holy. And in fact, when you sit at the Shabbat table on Shabbat evening and you light candles, which the rabbis instituted, that was not done in the temple. When you sit on Shabbat and light candles and you bless your bread, which was instituted by the rabbis based on what was done in the temple, that bread becomes your offering. Your dinner table becomes your sacrificial altar. That becomes your holy temple. Over time, that holiness became the Torah, because there were many copies made of the Torah, and these were each kept in different synagogues. And wherever the Torah was kept, that was the synagogue, that was the gathering point, and that was where the center of Judaism became the synagogue, the location where the Torah was stored. We're now living in an interesting time where that holiness is once again transferring to your homes. You're all sitting at home right now, I hope, and you're engaging in the holiest of activities, which is Talmud Torah, limud, study. This is also the same places where you pray. What a strange time to be living in when, these are major changes in the history of Judaism. And the center of prayer has again moved back to the home. I don't know what that means for the future. I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, so I don't make predictions. Holy spaces. You often hear me comment during a service that you should rise physically if you're able, and if you're unable to physically rise, the Talmud tells us to direct your heart. I am probably the only rabbi who says it that way, although every rabbi should start doing this. If you know a rabbi who's not saying that, you can say, my rabbi told me, look at Mishnah Brachot. It says you don't have to stand, and in fact, if you're unable to stand, you're supposed to direct your heart. How do we know this? They use an example of if you're traveling and you're riding on a donkey, you should get down from the donkey to pray. So praying is important. You should interrupt what you're doing to make sure that you are praying, that you're giving it your full focus. But if you're unable to get down from the donkey, you're traveling in a caravan and they're not willing to stop. You've done everything you can, everything you can reasonably do to make sure that you're standing still and focused and facing toward Jerusalem. You should at least turn your face toward Jerusalem. And if you cannot turn your face, one should direct his heart. Again, this is written in masculine language, but applies to men and women. One should direct one's heart to the Holy of Holies. Same thing if you're traveling on a ship, on a wagon, or a raft, you direct your heart toward the Holy of Holies. In a different, a little bit later in the next Mishnah, in fact, we read, one should not stand to say tefillah except in a reverent state of mind. So if you're going to stand, you're not going through the motions. You have to actually be praying. You can't just stand up and say the words. You have to actually be praying. And in fact, if you can't be in the state of mind of actually praying, according to the Mishnah, how do I know it's the Mishnah? Because it says M. There's a funny word, but it's not followed by a number and a letter, right? It's got to be the Mishnah. Even if it didn't have the M there, I would know it was the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says one should not stand up to say tefillah except in a reverent state of mind. The pious men of old would wait an hour before praying in order that they might direct their thoughts to God. And this translation, thoughts, is actually libo, direct their hearts to God, literally. Even if a king greets him while praying, he should not answer him, even if a snake is wound around his heel, or around his ankle, I would probably translate. He should not stop. So as you're praying, in the act of prayer, nothing should interrupt you. That's how important it is. By the way, the pious men of old, we won't have time in this class because it's a pretty basic. We're covering things. I shouldn't say pretty basic. We do go into some depth, but this is a little bit further than we'll go in this class. The beginning of the Hasidim and the Mitnagim, where the Hasidim said, no, Judaism is supposed to be a passionate, soulful, faithful religion. This is where Chabad comes from Hasidic Judaism. Chabad was one group of Hasidic Jews, and they actually took this practice literally. They would pray for an hour before each prayer. I don't know if they still do that today. You have to ask a Hasidic rabbi, but that was the followers of the Baal Shem Tov, of the first Hasidic rabbi, who actually instituted this practice. They would pray for an hour just to get into the right mindset to begin their prayer, as opposed to the Mitnagdim, who were a different group of Orthodox Jews at that time, who believed in, no, we've got to pray according to, the letter of the law. It says you begin your prayer at such and such a time and you finish at such and such a time, and that's what you've got to do. Let me just check. I want to make sure that's not an important message. All right. You can still hear me, right? You can still hear me, right? Okay. So let's talk about keva and kavanah. Just leave it. Let's talk about keva and kavanah. These are two major forces in Jewish prayer, and we often find ourselves discussing the balance between them. The first keva is the fixed, literally it means fixed or correct method of prayer. This is how we engage in following these specific instructions where I say, okay, you stand here, you bow here, you say these words, you follow this structured format. That's all keva. All of that is keva. All of the rules that you follow, that's keva. Now this stands in contrast to kavanah, which means literally intention, but it's the spirit of the prayer. And as you saw from these passages from the Mishnah, this balance is an ancient idea in Judaism of how do you reconcile and harmonize these two forces in your prayer. How do you pray with immediacy and still have that expression of prayer that connects you with tradition? That push and pull is a part of why you have different expressions of Judaism today, why you have Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism and Chabad Judaism and all of these different forms of Judaism. It's still Judaism, it's still the same prayers, it's still the same structure, it's still the same keva. But this relationship between keva and kavanah is a little bit different. You won't find a rabbi playing a guitar in an Orthodox shul on Shabbat, because that would be a violation of keva, of the prayer. But it's very common to see guitar or piano or even a full band in a Reform temple for a Shabbat service, because it enhances kavanah. When you're swept in the music, or swept up in the music, I should say, that raises your spirit, that raises your prayer. When you're singing with other people, then that raises your prayers together. As opposed to rapidly going through every single word of the prayer, making sure you don't miss a letter, but it ends up sounding like a long mumble to try to fit everything into the 1 hour you have, set aside for prayer. Is there different approaches to Jewish prayer, a different balance, different relationship, different synthesis of keva and kavanah? It's something that if you're doing Judaism right, this tension should be with you every single day for the rest of your life. The tension between these and finding that balance. Realizing, wait, I've gone too far with kavanah and I've got this great feeling, but I'm not praying in Hebrew enough, or I'm disconnected from my ancestors. I'm disconnected from my Lashon Kodesh, my holy language of Hebrew. That I've lost that meditative state of repeating the same words every single day. Helps you enter a sort of meditative state where the words pass over you and through you in a way that you cannot achieve without repeating them every day. Those are just a couple of examples. You'll find a lot more, and you won't need my help to find them, of this tension between keva and kavanah. And really, Judaism is not a choice between them, but a synthesis of them together. Of course, this exists in modern prayer. What are some of the ways that modern prayer deals with this? Well, we have holiday liturgy. You might not think of our special holiday prayers as modern liturgy, but we know that these are later additions to our prayer book. We know that there was not a special prayer for Hanukkah. We know that the many of the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the high holidays, were added to the prayer book later. We know that many of our prayers sort of came later in the development of our keva. That holiday liturgy, in many cases, was added later than the earliest prayers. We also have added, beginning, well, going back to the beginning of Jewish prayer, interpretive readings, readings which are inspired by the meaning of the fixed prayer, but which the literal words may be different. It might be a creative interpretation or a creative translation of a particular prayer, or it might be something totally unrelated, a piece of poetry or a piece of poetic liturgy that is connected with the theme of a prayer. You see this very, very commonly. This is, you'll see this in all of the services that I conduct, where I'm carefully selecting different interpretive prayers from a wide variety of sources to bring to you, because I believe that it enhances, at least it enhances my prayer, and I hope it enhances your prayer. Holiday prayers I already talked about. I don't know, I have it there twice. Prayers for modern holidays, holidays of the state of Israel, right? The prayer for the state of Israel, that didn't exist before 1948, I promise you. Right? We have prayers for special Israeli holidays. We have prayers for other modern holidays, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaAtzmaut. We're going to talk about all of those later in the springtime, actually, as those holidays are approaching. And one note that I would like to end on is a great paradigm from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Heschel. If you don't know who Abraham Joshua Heschel is, you should. One of the great rabbis of the 20th century. And one of the things that he did when he was marching with Martin Luther King over the Selma Bridge, while he was imprisoned afterwards, because they were all arrested, he wrote, while he was in the jail cell, he wrote this message to his followers. Here was a rabbi who was, by the way, rescued from the Nazis, who was brought over to America by the Hebrew Union College, by my alma mater, where I was trained as a rabbi, where he was a professor, and he was also a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the seminary of the conservative movement. Everything that he went through, and he said, when I was marching across that bridge, I was praying with my feet. I think there's a powerful, powerful message, and you'll hear this phrase a lot in contemporary Judaism, praying with our feet. We need to pray with our feet. We started off praying with offerings of flour or bulls or oils. We evolved and we started praying with the words that we spoke. We continued and we started praying with our hearts. And now it's time, there's a new form of prayer, to pray with our feet, meaning the actions that we take in the name of God are sacred actions. That is a form of prayer too. I'm going to leave it on that note. We'll stop the recording and we'll have at least a little bit of time for questions.